Have you ever been concerned with how your child can learn new skills? In this episode of Behavior Nation's education video series, we will be talking about prompting and different types you can use to increase responding of targeted skills. In this presentation, we will discuss what it is, when we use it, why we use it, and lastly, the different hierarchies and the types of prompts we can use. Let's start off with prompting and what it is. Prompting is referred to as the level of instruction that is provided to a learner when they are asked to complete a task. This level of instruction helps the learner complete the task. Prompting also refers to providing assistance or specific cues to increase the use of a specific skill. Any additional cue or assistance that is needed for a learner to engage in the correct behavior is known as a prompt. An example of a prompt is telling your child to say hi when someone walks through the front door. Next, we are going to be discussing why we use prompting. We use prompting to help the learner be successful. If we are teaching a new behavior, we want the learner to be able to complete the behavior successfully. We also use it to create a lot of opportunities. For example, we can prompt 5 opportunities of matching and then give the learner the opportunity to complete the skill independently. We also use prompting to practice the skill in multiple environments. If the learner can do the skill at home but can't do it at school, school staff can use prompting procedures to increase independence of the behavior at school. Now that we understand why we use it, let's talk about when we use it. We can use prompting anytime we teach a new skill. This ensures that the client will be successful when learning and have access to reinforcement, which strengthens the skill we are teaching. We can also use prompting if the learner responds incorrectly. For example, if the learner is directed to touch red and they touch blue, we can gesture for them to touch red to ensure they do it correctly. We also want to make sure we fade prompts, that way our learners do not become prompt dependent. Prompt fading is the process of eliminating the prompt and having the learner respond to the natural cue. You can do this by slowly moving away from the prompt and decreasing assistance. You can also do this by inserting a time delay. This looks like giving a direction and waiting for the learner to complete the direction. Moving on, we will be discussing prompting hierarchies and the different types of prompts. The first prompting hierarchy we are going to discuss is least to most prompting, which is also known as increasing assistance. This means that we provide the smallest amount of assistance needed first and then move on to providing more and more assistance as needed. The order of these prompts would be model, moving on to a gesture prompt, then to a textual or visual prompt, then to a positional prompt, and then to a physical, and lastly, a verbal prompt. For example, we would start with a gestural prompt, and if the client needs more assistance, we will use a partial physical prompt. For example, if we are teaching touch red, we would want the learner to touch red with a gestural prompt first, and then if they need more help, we can use a partial physical prompt, which would gently guide their elbow to reach out and touch red. Each of these prompts provides more and more assistance than the last. Another example is that we may start by pointing and then move to placing the correct answer closer to the learner, which is known as a positional prompt. Next, let's move on to most to least prompting. Most to least prompting is also known as decreasing assistance. We use most to least prompting when we are starting with more intrusive prompts. For example, we would start with a physical prompt instead of gesturing. If we are teaching a new skill, we will use most to least prompting. The order of these prompts are verbal to physical to positional to textual and or visual to then a gesture and lastly a model prompt. If we're teaching a child to touch red and the client needs prompting, we can physically prompt 3 times and then move to a gesture prompt, and lastly have the individual independently perform the skill of touching red. This is the opposite of least to most prompting. Errorless learning is another aspect of most to least prompting, and we are going to discuss that in the next slide. With errorless learning, the learner is given the direction and immediately prompted to make the correct response. This allows access to reinforcement and decreases frustration. However, this prompting style has the potential to create prompt dependence. The goal of errorless learning is to fade the prompt over time. Prompt fading looks like using least intrusive prompts until the learner makes the correct response. We are now going to transition to specific prompts and what they look like. The first prompt we will discuss is the positional prompt. This prompt places the correct or needed item closest to the learner. For example, if the direction is to match blue, the needed match card will be closest to the learner. The next prompt is known as a textual or visual prompt. A textual or visual prompt is a written cue to direct the learner. For example, we can hand the client a break card and they can request for a break. On this break card may be the word break, or it may be the picture of someone requesting for a break or taking a break. The next prompt we are going to move on to is a gesture prompt. A gesture is any time we gesture to something for the learner to do. A gesture can be anything from pointing to nodding or shrugging. Another example would be a teacher using a finger over their lips to gesture for students to be quiet. Sometimes we use gesture prompts unintentionally and they may be overused. Next, we will be moving on to model prompts. A model prompt is when we demonstrate or show the learner how to do a specific skill. For example, we may demonstrate how to put a book on the table. However, to be able to use a model prompt, the learner must first be able to look at others and be able to copy the actions of others. This can be a very successful prompt for learners who imitate. Next, we will be discussing verbal prompts. Verbal prompts are when we use words to tell the learner what to do, or we use words to give an answer. Verbal prompts are the most common form of prompting, and they can be very hard to fade. For example, we may use a partial or full verbal prompt. A partial verbal prompt looks like "heh" for help if the client needs to request help. And a full verbal prompt for this same example would be the teacher stating help if the learner needs to ask for help. Let's move on to physical prompts. Physical prompts are known as hand-over-hand prompting, and they are either partial physical or full physical prompts. For example, for partial physical prompting, a client's elbow is guided to pick up a shoelace, and then the learner would independently tie the rest of their shoes. For a full physical prompt, a client's hands would be guided through all the steps of tying their shoes. Now that we have discussed all the prompts, let's talk about the takeaways from this presentation. In conclusion, prompting allows us to teach new skills. It allows us to give the learner access to reinforcement, which increases the likelihood the skill will occur again in the future. And lastly, we use either least to most or most to least prompting strategies, depending on the learner, how they learn, and what skill we are teaching. Thank you for watching this presentation, and if you have any questions, feel free to reach out to us via email at info@behaviornation.com, via phone number at 844-262-8466, or feel free to find information on our website at www.behaviornation.com. Thank you.